Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our conversation. I am Mathieu Bussières. I'm the director of the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal. I'm happy to welcome you all to our conversation. We co-host this event with the Potsdam Institute and the IMCCS. What I'll do, and I'll start by introducing our panelists. I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then we'll go into a conversation. So let me first introduce General Eirik Kristoffersen to my right. He's the current Norwegian Chief of Defense since 2020 and the Dean of the NATO Military Committee. Welcome. To my far left, we have General Retired Tom Middendorp, used to be the Netherlands Chief of Defense, author of the book The Climate General, which was published in 2023, and also the chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. To my left, Erin Sikorsky, who is the director of the Center on Climate Security, based in Washington, D.C. And to my far right, we have Dr. Barbora Šedová from the Potsdam Institute on Climate Impact Research. So you should, first of all, ask your question, why are we here having this conversation today? And I would say that, from our perspective, there's really no scenario where defense institutions, and I'm talking the Ministry of Defense, but also the armed forces, are not impacted by climate change. This is true now, and it will worsen over time. And this is something that needs to be considered not only by military and civilian leadership, but also by military planners and operators. So obviously, and we heard about it, and we'll still hear about it today, the current geopolitical environment brings its load of challenges. Short-term, medium-term, and long-term challenges. But I think that we are responding, and the governments are responding, and clearly, in a NATO context, the defense institutions are responding. We have seen recently, over the last decade, the Canadian and European nations increasing substantially their defense budget. And they will continue to do so in the future. So as we invest to transform our armed forces, to respond to those challenges that we're discussing today, we certainly hope that we will consider at the same time the impact that are brought by a changing climate into the operating environment. The other thing that I think we can also all agree on is that decision-making needs to be based on data, on proven data. It also needs to be based on solid scientific evidence. And this is why we brought these panelists today. What we're trying to achieve with this conversation is bridging the gap between science and military strategy. And what we're trying to achieve is to use that knowledge and transform it into actionable advice for decision makers. So the way we've constructed this conversation, and this is how it will being laid out in the next 45 minutes, is I will invite Dr. Šedová to present a scene setter based on science that will lay the foundation of our discussions to demonstrate the impact of climate change now and in the future. And then I will ask the panelists to comment on that. We have questions, but obviously this is a conversation, so we welcome also free-flowing interactions between the panelists. And I hope we'll have some time for questions at the end from the audience as well. So let's get this show on the road. Dr. Šedová, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Mathieu, for your kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. Our planet is changing faster than we have ever anticipated. Human activity has driven us to a critical juncture, one where the stability, resilience, and the very life support of the planet Earth are at risk. The Planetary Boundaries Framework, which defines 9 Earth system processes essential for safe operating space for humanity, now warns us that 6 of these nine boundaries have been breached, among others, climate, pollution, and freshwater change. 5 years ago, we entered the decisive decade, one where our choices will shape the future of generations to come. Today, as we stand at the half point, I will take you through a brief snapshot of scientific realities of our planet, focusing on one critical boundary, the climate change. A decade ago, the world came together to sign the Paris Agreement, a commitment to limit global warming to well beyond 2 degrees Celsius with efforts to stay within 1.5 degree warming. Yet here we stand today. Global mean temperature has already increased by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the year 2024, so the last year, has shattered records as the warmest year in history. For the first time, we have exceeded the 1.5 degrees of warming. Even more alarming is that the warming is accelerating. If we stay on this path, within the next 20 years, we will hit the 2 degrees of warming, and by the end of centuries, we will be by almost 3 degrees of warmings compared to pre-industrial times. The consequences will be devastating and are all caused by us humans. And here's the critical point. The impacts won't be simply 3 times of what we see today in a world that is approximately 1 degree warmer than compared to pre-industrial times. Due to nonlinear effects, we are looking at significantly larger dangers and devastation, disrupting economies, ecosystems, and societies in so far unprecedented ways. Already now, extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and storms are intensifying, and slow onset processes such as the sea level rise are accelerating. And the science is clear. These impacts can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change. And the societal consequences are already devastating and undeniable, including food and water stress, heat-related mortality, higher risk of conflict, forced migration, and immobility. However, these impacts are not distributed equally. The most vulnerable countries, those with weaker institutions and lower capacities to address these risks, are hit the hardest. For example, in the past decade, the average mortality from floods, droughts, and storms was 15 times higher in vulnerable countries such as Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Somalia compared to the richer countries that are less vulnerable, including the UK, Australia, and Canada. 90% of world's refugees fleeing conflict are from countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. These are the same nations that host approximately 70% of world's internally displaced population due to conflict and violence. All of this is happening at just 1.2 degrees Celsius. But recall, we are on a path towards 3 degrees of warming. Even within the Paris Agreement's goal, the risk will be enormous. Already at 1.5 degree warming, multiple climate tipping points may be activated. These thresholds are thresholds in Earth systems beyond which global scale irreversible damage will occur. At just 1.5 degree warming, it is likely that we will see the collapse of Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, the die-off of coral reefs, and widespread abrupt permafrost thaw. Other tipping points may become possible. The societal impacts of climate change will intensify in ways that are both non-linear and unimaginable. As warming continues, the limits to adaptations will be crossed. For example, small island states could become uninhabitable already at 1.5 degree warming, forcing entire populations to leave their homes. And the economic toll of these impacts is tremendous. If we stay on this trajectory, by 2050, this will cost us approximately 18% of annual GDP, corresponding to 38 trillion US dollars lost every year. The armed forces are not immune to the escalating impacts of climate change. In fact, they face critical challenges. Climate change disrupts military infrastructure and operational capabilities. Intensifying extreme weather events damage critical infrastructure, disrupt supply chain, and interfere with missions and logistics. Climate change also reshapes global security landscapes with direct implications for military operations. Among the greatest worries are conflicts over changing availability of resources. In fragile agricultural countries, such as those in the Middle East and the Sahel, climate change threatens food security and livelihoods, increasing the risk of conflict. Meanwhile, the accelerated melting in the Arctic ice sheet is opening a new front for great power rivalry by enabling new shipping routes and access to untapped resources. Climate change increases demands on military that go also beyond activities related to conflict. Armed forces are increasingly called upon to provide humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and emergency response due to extreme weather events. So to conclude, in a world that is 1.2 degrees warmer, we are witnessing the devastating consequences of climate change. These risks are accelerating, and even within the Paris Agreement goals, they become significantly worse. We have just 5 years to keep the goal, the 1.5 degree goal, within the reach. The choices we make today will decide the future that we are facing and that our children will face. They will decide whether we curb the crisis or allow it to spiral beyond control. The cost of inaction is simply too high, and the time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Šedová, for that sobering analysis. I'll turn to you, General, to start and ask you a generic but important question, and your views on how the Norwegian armed forces are adapting to the challenge of climate change. And if I could also have your views on how this may become an opportunity to strengthen Allied competitive advantage, including against adversaries such as Russia.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you. Sorry. Thank you for the introduction. I think it's very solid proof that climate change is one of the most existential threats we are facing. And in Norway, you can actually see it. So I grew up in northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle. And in my small hometown, you can see the effects of climate change already. You can see glaciers disappearing. You can see animals moving in that you have never seen before, that used to stay south of the Arctic Circle. So you see the change. In the more global perspective, you see the change in the melting of the ice around the North Pole and the opening up of new sea routes. For instance, the Northern Sea route that goes from Norway all the way north of Russia and over to the Pacific. So this is all connected. It's globally. and it's connected. So our military is first and foremost there to prevent war. So there is nothing climate friendly about war. So we have to prevent war. At the same time, we have to adapt to climate change, and we have to see opportunities as well. So what we are doing is, first of all, we are adapting to the new climate. As we heard, different weather conditions, change actually the change in the ground, especially on the sea routes, more disaster relief, basically. We are adapting to all that. We are also doing our part in reducing CO2 emissions, because I'm certain that the military that first is able to use all the technology that comes from this green shift we are talking about and doing will have an advantage. So the less dependent we become on fossil fuel energy, the more sustainable our military will be. And finally, I also would say that even if we're not measured on climate in the military, we can do it. So Norway is doing it. We are measuring our CO2 emissions. We are measuring what we are doing regarding to climate change. And if we don't do this, we could end up being the last one using old technology. And that's very dangerous. And history has shown that military very often is a conservative organization that doesn't adapt to new technology fast enough. So you have to be in the forefront of this as a Western military, as a NATO alliance, to be sure that we are adapting to new technology and take the advantage of all the technology that is coming out of the focus on climate change now. So we are doing a lot, but we need to do more.
No, thank you for this insightful remarks, especially on the need to change fast. The technological landscape has changed tremendously in the last decades, and I think it will be important for armed forces to keep up with the change. Let's move from Norway maybe to a different region, and General Middendorp, I'll turn to you. In your book, you talk about your experience in Afghanistan. What did you learn there on the ground? And looking back, what kind of data would have been useful to make sure that you're effectively fulfilling your mission?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think the previous speakers explained the enormous security effects we can expect from a changing climate. It is a driver of future conflicts. It really disrupts regions, especially fragile regions around the world. And it has all kinds of negative spin-off effects on security, like migration flows, like criminality, like extremism. So it will confront us in many ways, and we need to take that seriously. And climate change is for many military a very uncomfortable topic. It's something distant, something for other departments, something far away from their core business. And I think we need to realize that it is an essential part of our core business. And I've seen that in my recent experiences in Afghanistan, where I saw how water shortages created all kinds of local tensions in populations, and how the Taliban used those tensions to gain a leverage and create a power base over the population. We were fighting the Taliban, but we didn't take away those tensions because we didn't understand that climate change was driving that. And later, when we saw that and we were able to negotiate a solution on water management, then it became quiet, and then the Taliban couldn't return anymore. So this example kind of shows the interrelationship between climate and our work as a military. And I think we need to realize that we need to understand how climate change affects our work. And to understand that, you need science. And science is what we bring together also in the network that Erin and I lead, the IMCCS network. We have experts from more than 40 countries all over the world, and another network of scientific institutes that take that knowledge and translate that into science. And that science is helpful. That can help the military to better understand the drivers of conflict, to better understand what we are facing. And I think it's crucial to understand that, because what are you fighting if you don't understand the enemy? So what can science bring to the table? I think science and defense have a long history together, especially on technology. defense has often been a platform for technological development and for new sciences. But in this case, in climate, it's the other way around. I think the science can help the military to move forward in many ways. They can support scenario-based training by providing climate risk scenarios that will be affecting the military work. We can take those scenarios and translate that into our concepts. It can help integrate climate risks into military risk assessments. It can help in red teaming and wargaming to challenge our plans, to make them more robust against these kind of influences. And it can help us to get more informed decision-making in our decision-making processes, because the more we understand the threat, the better we can handle it. So I am a firm believer in building new kinds of ecosystems, and these ecosystems should embrace both the defense side and the scientific side. Together we are much stronger. And I see good examples. I see good examples in the Potsdam Institute with the Weathering Risk Initiative. I see it in IMCCS I just mentioned, but also in the Water, Peace and Security Program, where very detailed scientific analysis helps to create forecasting, helps to create early warning, and helps us to be prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. I would add too that the educational aspect is equally important as we transfer this knowledge into the military institutions, making sure that the men and women in uniform know how to actually use this knowledge and turn it into advice for military and civilian leadership is equally important. General, well, both generals talk about the relationship between the military and the civilian authorities that is definitely growing. Coming from Canada, we certainly experience it on a yearly basis. I'll turn to you, Erin, to talk a little bit about the fact that the armed forces are increasingly called upon to support civilian authorities when climate-driven hazards occur. And we heard from Dr. Šedová that these things will just grow in numbers over time. We certainly see it already. The big question now is the balance between supporting these civilian authorities and the core mission of the armed forces, which is to provide deterrence and defense, especially in the NATO context. How do we expect this dual role, this evolving role, to affect our ability to conduct these missions? And how can investments in defense can help and adapt and build resilience of our armed forces moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Mathieu. This is a great morning, or way to start my morning at MSC with this conversation. As Dr. Šedová and all of you have alluded to, militaries are already responding to these hazards. The Center for Climate and Security, which I lead, we track these deployments, and since June of 2022, we've seen 500 deployments in nearly 100 countries around the globe in response to hurricanes, floods, wildfires. And as you said, militaries are having to grapple with the challenge of doing that at the same time they're trying to do their core mission. Canada, as you mentioned, in the summer of 2023, deployed for 130 consecutive days, which was a record for them, thousands of troops in response to wildfires, and it sparked a debate within the country about what is this doing to distract from training, from operational readiness, right? How are we meeting our mission? Here in Europe, just this fall with Storm Boris, which hit much of Eastern Europe, required the deployment of 26,000 troops in Poland, which the Chief of Defense said was their largest military deployment of Polish armed forces ever. But at the same time, the military also warned that they saw an increase, a spike in disinformation related to the floods of 300% coming from Russian and Belarusian sources. And so I think that highlights this issue of vulnerability, right, that countries have in these moments when climate hazards hit. And deterrence and defense is always about being able to minimize those vulnerabilities. Right? So investments in resilience, investments in adaptation, not only within the militaries, but within societies and countries, is going to then help meet the moment and prevent those challenges. I think the other thing that deterrence in defense is about is preserving freedom of action, right, and flexibility. And so this is another place where I think investment in adaptation and resilience within militaries, whether it's to be able to deploy in hotter temperatures, right, or to make sure that your equipment still works in waters whose salinity is changing, right, or understanding where you might see new conflicts emerge, all of that contributes to your ability to deter and defend. So I think sometimes we hold these two things up as in opposition. Either you deal with climate or you deal with deterrence and defense. But I think as we've heard here, you have to be able to do both, right? Otherwise you'll miss things or get things wrong.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, when we're investing in platforms that are used for decades, really important to set those requirements clearly at the beginning. So these platforms are as efficient in 40, 50 years as they are now. General, can I turn back to you and talk about a little bit about NATO and interoperability, which has been a motto of the alliance since its creation. And I'd like your views on whether we can see those changes and the transformational aspects that we're talking about in facing the challenge brought by climate change. Is it an occasion for NATO to be able to improve military cooperation over time?
Yeah, I think definitely this is an opportunity. So we have to think of opportunities and not only be scared by threats. So it's always opportunities. And one of the real opportunities we have is in NATO is to work together and share experience and knowledge. So one of the things that I've seen, and it's not directly related to climate change, but it's how we in NATO now starts talking about effects. What sort of effects do we want to achieve? So we are moving away from a platform-centric thinking to a more effects-based thinking. And this gives new opportunities. So instead of buying, old technology, which is upgraded to 2025, we can find new technology that is more effects-based and more adapted to the environment we are operating in. So one example is in Norway, we always had large combined joint exercises during winter time. When it was snow, it was cold, and the idea was that everything that works in the Arctic will work everywhere else. And that's true. If it works under those conditions, it usually works everywhere else. It's not the opposite. You can have equipment made for other areas, but it doesn't work in the Arctic. So in these exercises, we exercised during winter time, and when the winter was over, the snow was melting, all the tracks from the exercise and everything was gone. So it was a great arena to try out new equipment and experience the effects of working in a very tough climate. What we see now is that because of climate change, we see that the ground is not as frozen anymore. We have different types of climate when we do these old exercises that has been going on for many, many years. And you have to adapt to a new situation where things you expected years ago, you cannot do it anymore. And it challenged the whole way of thinking when it comes to investments. And you also have to realize that the technology is driven on the civilian sector, because that's where the huge innovation happen. And then we need to adapt that to the military. And when we do this, when we do transformation and modernization, we also send a signal that we are postured and ready to fight future wars. So what we are, with the huge investments that are coming in the Norwegian defense now, my concern is that we are replicating yesterday's defense in a sort of upgraded version instead of investing in a modern effect-based defense for the future. So this is something we're talking about in NATO amongst the chief of defenses for years, and we see that coming into action now. And it goes back to what I talked about, how to become more sustainable in the future, also when it comes to logistics in the armed forces. So you're doing a lot of experimentation now, and we are flying F-35s now, the new fighter jet, with sustainable aviation fuel. So we are looking for other sources of energy also to use in our military. And we have to do these things now, because as Barbara said, this is happening. We need to speed up the process of change.
Very interesting, and I would add as well that strategic foresight analysis to make sure that we're not replicating what we've done before in an upgraded fashion, but actually really think about what the future will look like is important. And you're right in saying that NATO does look into this. General Middendorp, I just want to come back to one of the things that you've said, because you've did talk about how to translate climate science into actionable information. But one of the things, to be honest, that we see is a certain level of still skepticism within the militaries on how relevant this advice is when it comes to military planning. How can we be able to convince military leaders that are still need to be convinced about the importance of this and show the benefit of integrating such an information into their mission, into their acquisition strategies, into their strategic planning?
Well, as I said, for military, it's quite an uncomfortable topic. It's seen as distant, but it's also seen as an additional cost driver. It is seen as something that hampers operational effectiveness. How far can an electric tank go? They make jokes about it. So, and that's the way they look at it. But we also see that in society. Climate change is something distant, and of course it is there, but we don't want to take it too seriously and put a lot of money in it. So I think what we do wrong, also from a science perspective, is that we approach it top down. We look at climate and we do a lot of analysis on it in very much detail, and we see a big problem building up, and then we try to explain and convince the whole world that they need to adapt. Mm-hmm. But for the people, that's not very tangible or recognizable. It's very distant. I think it's important in the work also within NATO to do it the other way around, to look at climate change from an operational perspective, look at the impacts of climate change and approach it from there. Show the climate change as a threat multiplier, show the opportunities that climate change can bring, and relate that back towards climate change. But don't talk about it too much, but approach it from the security side. And I think that would be very helpful, and I think it's very much needed if you translate it into the military to link it to core mission objectives, like as mentioned by the general, and make it a matter of operational readiness. A second thing is that I think we need to look at the narratives that we use. Very climate-related narratives don't convince the audiences in this time frame. And I know in the US they are working on finding their ways to do that, but I think we have to find new narratives to bring the message across, using more the day-to-day problems that people feel, make it very tangible for the people. You are suffering from energy crisis, or you are suffering from floodings because of, and start at the point of impact. And use a lot of concrete examples. I think concrete examples really help. I was traveling last year in Somalia and Iraq and Bangladesh to show the relationship between climate change and security. In Somalia, we showed how climate change drives people away, how it leads to migration, how it leads to piracy. In Iraq, we showed how climate change leads to extremism. And by showing it that way and then translating that back to your own security interests, it becomes very concrete, because it's already happening, and it's not something distant. You bring it close by. And last but not least, I think it's important to show the operational benefits, as mentioned. I think there is a huge opportunity here. The whole energy transition, for instance, is so an enormous technological revolution as well. It can help the military to become much more self-sustaining and much more autonomous in their operations. And if you look at the future of military capabilities, who doesn't want to be autonomous? And we have huge supply chains. It's the biggest cost driver of any military mission, the biggest risk factor of any military mission. It costs lives. When we can reduce that logistical burden, it really helps to boost operational effectiveness. And I think if you look at it from that side, there is a lot of opportunity here. And not only on energy, but on many other areas as well. New technologies can help us produce water on the spot, energy on the spot, print spare parts on the spot. So you can reduce on all functional areas the logistical burden. And that should be appealing to any military, I would say.
I would even add, on a logistical standpoint, that further cooperation between allies in making sure, or in supporting these chains, may simplify a lot of problems that we see. And they're like low-hanging fruit. It's not based on new technology. It's just based on common sense and optimization of
exactly.
Of
and that's the power of NATO, but also what we do in the IMCCS. By connecting, you can use each other's experiences. You can use best practices. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that goes much faster.
Absolutely. Dr. Šedová, can I turn to you and just bounce back on some of the things that the General said about the tangibility of the advice. I know climate science is not necessarily always tangible, but in your view, what could help armed forces better prepare for these challenges, but also build the resilience required?
Thanks. Yes, so first I would like to underline the point that which has been already mentioned a couple of times, that scientific information in climate science can importantly inform armed forces and militaries, help them anticipate risk, adapt, and basically gain a strategic advantage in this way. And just thinking about the products or tools that we have contributed to at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So we have different type of assessment tools that help to, inform or provide relevant information regarding the short-term preparedness, but also in terms of long-term planning. So, for example, currently, or last year actually, we have launched the Climate Conflict Vulnerability Index. This is an open source tool that provides high resolution information about where climate risks, conflict hazards, and places of high vulnerability overlap, and could basically lead to new escalations in the near future. And this is maybe also building up on what has been just said, that illustrating the impacts is very important. So this tool basically helps us to identify areas of concern where the impacts could unfold even more severely. And then we have also tools or basically data that illustrate different climate futures. So we have climate change projections and climate change impacts projections that could show you how the world would look like by the end of century if we implement stringent climate policies, so in optimistic scenarios, but also in more pessimistic scenarios. And this is also something that we actually processed within the Weathering Risk project that was mentioned today. And of course, this data is quite complex to understand, so it's important to process them and communicate them in a way that is digestible and yeah, for like an outcome could be of such projections could be showcasing places where sea level rise impacts or extreme weather impacts could become very severe, which is very important for military bases and critical infrastructure. And the third type of product is about, complex modeling of the relationships between climate hazards and the different types of conflict risks. Because I think while showcasing where areas of concern is important, it's also very important to understand why climate-related conflicts happen in order to mitigate them in the first place, so before they even escalate. So there are different type of analysis and tools that climate science can offer that could be very, very valuable, reaching from mapping to complex system modeling.
So you picked up the mic.
Yeah, I agree with what's being said, and I also agree with what was said earlier, that we need to come up with some examples. We need to turn this not in a big picture, but what does it mean for our people, for each and every soldier in the armed forces? What does it mean? What can he do or she do to combat the climate change? And then we need some very tangible examples. And I think what we are doing now with 3D printing, sustainable aviation fuel, 3D printing when it comes to spare parts, people understand this. We're trying to make our bases more self-sustained, having different energy sources, electrical power, solar power, wind power, whatever we can come up with. And when you start looking at this, because I agree with that everybody wants to be autonomous. You want to have freedom to operate in the military and not be so dependent on a lot of other or long supply chains. So when we come up with these concrete examples, I think that's where we can meet the sort of very dark picture we see for the future when it comes to what's happening with our climate now.
A lot has to do with packaging the message properly as well, using science. And I would say that, we talked about training, or I did talk about training in education, but wargaming as well, and using the science to underpin some of the war games that are being developed as we speak would be quite valuable. Erin, I'd be remiss if I did not take the opportunity of you being here to ask a question about the new U.S. administration and the impact it could have on the efforts that we're deploying in the field of climate security from a U.S. perspective, but also in a wider NATO frame. That I certainly would like your views on that.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it, right? I think if anyone listened to Secretary Hegseth's confirmation hearings on the Hill, he made it very clear that climate will not be a priority for his leadership. Also, just recently, he was asked about Elon Musk's DOGE team coming to the Pentagon, and he specifically mentioned climate programs as a place that they might look to go after. But I think it's important to ask the question, what does that actually mean to not work on climate change at the Pentagon, right? Does that mean they're not going to invest in resilience in bases in Florida or along the coast as hurricanes come more frequently? Does it mean that the National Guard will not respond domestically to hazards, right? If you're going to deploy Iron Dome in Alaska, are you not going to take account of permafrost thaw, right, and what that might mean? So I think military is pragmatic, and there are a lot of military leaders at lower levels who recognize the risks that climate poses to operations, to resilience, and they're going to continue to make smart choices, right? But it will be harder, and I worry a lot about, we're talking here about education and training and the need to build a climate resilient workforce in militaries, that will become less available to the U.S. Military complex, which makes, frankly, the CASCOE more important, makes the work of NATO and IMCCS more important to fill that gap, to make sure that soldiers and civilians within the Defense Department have access to really good information and science to base decisions on, because our adversaries are doing that, right, and our competitors. China will absolutely integrate climate into its planning, and so it's a real risk for the United States if we don't, but it's going to be a challenging 4 years.
Thanks a lot. So I've been informed we have 3 minutes left, but I really want to see if anyone from the audience had a question. Sir? Not sure if we can get a mic to you quickly. Fabian, we'll make it.
André de Zucco-Pietri, you asked for concrete points. I mean, in the military, the whole topic of dronification, distributing smaller aspects, and this has to do with resilience, and the other topic on climate change is also about resilience. How do these two things come together? How do military capabilities, totally different than the huge big object we used to have, are coming along? Because, I mean, the climate message, we see it, is not working. So can we work that more also on the security, resilience, and different type of capabilities that we used to have?
Well, thank you for the question. I think so. I've been working. I retired 7 years ago, so I'm a history man for the military. But I've been approaching climate change from a security perspective, and what I've noticed is that by bringing it from that security perspective, by showing the risks that we are facing, it does make people listen that normally don't listen to the climate people. Climate is a left-wing Green Party topic in many countries, and defense is on the other side. And once you approach it from the other side, suddenly people start listening. And I think that's what we need to do more. Approach it from other angles, from security, but also from economy, from other areas, and show the impacts that the changing climate has to convince people that this is much more than just an ecological change. This is something that affects the whole of society on all its aspects. And the more we can make that clear, and the more you also can create kind of leading voices on that area that have credibility in the audiences, the more people start taking that seriously.
Yeah, I can just add, I agree with what you said. It's about making our military better, faster, and more lethal by using new technology, more self-sustained. And I think the Chief of the Air Force in Norway, he calls his plan for the future Air Force is greener and meaner. So it's going to be, it's going to be more self-sustained. It's going to spend less money on flight hours in training by using simulators. It's going to do all the things that it has to do to be more self-sustained and get down the costs. And then it will, of course, start adding autonomous systems and use whatever it can do to reduce CO2 emission, and by there also reducing costs and less dependence on logistics. So we are doing a lot across the force, but I also agree that it has to be more bottom-driven than top-down. Otherwise, you don't get the ownership to it. But we are working on that.
Yep, and I'm confident that the message is more and more understood. And we have a chief of defense here on this panel that actually talks about climate change today. So this is a real tangible example that the message is being understood and digested by armed forces. I would also argue, and I'm positive in trying to raise awareness, but if that doesn't work, reality will catch up no matter what. It's unfortunate to say, but the climate will continue its course, as Dr. Šedová pointed out. We're out of time. I think it was a very, very great discussion with good points all across. I liked, Erin, that you mentioned the work of CASCO. Clearly, this is what we're doing. This is a reflection of some of the activities that we want to pursue, raising the awareness, making sure that the message is understood, trying to share the knowledge, and building on some of the great things that are done in the wider communities as well, working as a hub to make sure that climate security, despite other challenging priorities, is still top of the agenda. So thank you very much for being with us, and have a great rest of the Munich Security Conference. Thank you.